So this morning, I want to look at 1 Kings chapter 17 and 18. This is the life of Elijah. And this is kind of tied to what we talked about 3 weeks ago when we talked about Paul Harvey. Remember the rest of the story? We looked at the book of Judges and how things fell apart really fast. That chain of passing on the faith to your children broke really quickly. Today, we're going to look at the final consequences of that. This is like the worst that it got, okay? So we're looking at 1 Kings 17 and 18. But first of all, I have a question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were where God wanted you to be, but you weren't quite sure what God wanted you to do? Okay? When we left for Romania in 1996, we had very specific plans what we were going to do. We had been recruited and asked to help start a theology department in a state university. Wow, is that cool? It's pretty unheard of things that could happen. You can't do that here, but we were going to do that in Romania. We arrived, everything was all set. The rector, the president of the university, had just retired. He said, everything's cool, everything's fine. I've talked to everyone, everything's in place, we're ready to launch. A few weeks later, after we arrived, he had a massive heart attack and died. And the new rector of the university was like, and who are you? And all of that stuff that he had set in place was this personal relationship, but when he was gone, that relationship was gone. And the new rector was not about to go out onto a limb and start a Baptist theology department in a state university in a post-communist country in Europe. There was just no way he was going to do that. And so we're wondering, what in the world is going on? And we felt like we were just waiting. Wondering, we had no question, we knew exactly this is where God wanted us to be. He had called us to Romania. And we thought we knew that what God wanted us to do. But he had other plans for us, and until that time, we were on hold. Looking back at it, hindsight, looking back at it years later, I can realize that was really the best thing that happened. If we had jumped into launching a department the first few weeks we were there, I don't know that we ever would have learned the language. We would have had to done it through interpreters. I don't know that we ever really would have been settled. I don't know that our children would have done well. But looking back on it, that gave us an opportunity to get our kids settled, to learn the language, get involved in a church plant, make friends. All very good and necessary things that probably would not have happened, at least not smoothly, if we had been so busy trying to start a department. But at the time, when that happened and that door slammed shut, we felt like we were stuck. I wouldn't say frustrated, but definitely confused, wondering what in the world God is doing. In 22 years in Romania, we've seen and experienced God's faithfulness. We've seen him at work in our lives and others. And it has been exciting, but it wasn't always. Those first few years, wondering what in the world is God doing, and feeling like we're stuck on hold, wondering what's next. And there were times I was like, hello, God, are you there? Did you forget us? Didn't you call us here to do something, and now we're doing not what we thought we were going to be doing? Look in 1 Kings chapter 17. We'll be in chapter 17 and 18, the life of Elijah. And when you think of Elijah, you probably think of a very exciting life, okay? Adventure, speaking to kings, performing miracles, raising the dead, really cool stuff. And all of that is true. He did every one of those things, but it wasn't always true for him. God did do great things through him. He did speak to kings. In fact, he confronted them about their sins. He confronted pagan prophets and won hands down. We're going to look at that confrontation today. He did perform amazing miracles, called down fire from heaven. That's pretty cool stuff. Raised the dead, the first resurrection recorded in Scripture. And he turned the people around so that they repented. But have you ever looked at his life as a whole? It's easy to notice the big events, the fancy stuff, the exciting things, and not notice there were a lot of times where he was just on hold, waiting, wondering what God was going to do through him. He knew he was where God told him to be. God had specifically said exactly where to be. But when he got there, it was like, and now what? Okay, now I don't want you to get lost in all the names and details here, but I want you to give you the historical context of Elijah's times, okay? Don't worry about the names. but listen for the pattern that repeats itself. Okay? In chapter 17, we know that he was from Gilead, and that is in the northern kingdom. Remember, the kingdom split about 60, 70 years previously. The kingdom split. Okay? So this is around 860 BC. Jeroboam was one of Solomon's sons who split the kingdom. Okay? And he took the northern 10 tribes. And one of the first things he does in 1 Kings 12, it says he put some golden calves in Bethel and Dan. Now, the Israelites did that one time before, a long time ago. Remember the Mount Sinai? They weren't supposed to do that. So it gives you a little hint here. Jeroboam's off onto a bad foot. Okay? He built shrines in high places and instituted pagan festivals. He reigned several years, and then his son became king. And in 1526, it says something about that son. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He reigned for 2 years, and then there was a coup, and the next guy murdered that guy and all his entire family. And then it says he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. You have this repeating refrain that you start to hear. The next king name was Elijah. He only served for 2 years. And the only thing it says about him is that most of the time he was drunk and he set up idols. Wow, we're on a roll here, aren't we? Okay. Then the chariot commander murders him and all of his family. Okay. Again, this pattern going on here. His name was Zimri. He was the chariot commander. The people plotted against him. He only reigned for 7 days. I mean, he was bad enough that even they thought he was bad. So there was another coup. Zimri locks himself up in his palace and burns the palace down with him in it. This would make a great Hollywood movie, wouldn't it? I mean, this constant plotting and murdering going on. And you see this pattern, and you think, surely it can't get any worse. Oh, yes, it can. Okay? Because that guy had a son named Omri. Okay? He reigned for 12 years. He founded a place called Samaria. Okay? We learn about that. That was the capital of the northern kingdom. 1625. This is what God says about him. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he adds something. And he sinned more than all of those before him. If you didn't think it could get worse, it just got worse. He reigned for 12 years, and he had a son named Ahab. Now, that name you've heard of before. He reigned for 22 years, his son. 1630, it says, he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So if you didn't think it could get bad, it just got a lot worse. And Ahab is where our story takes place today. So the northern kingdom never had a spiritual high point. I don't think they had a spiritual anything, but this is definitely the low point. Ahab has a lousy, wicked dad, and he's even worse. And he marries a woman named, does anyone remember what his wife's name was? Jezebel. Does anyone know what Jezebel means? I looked this up. It means dung heap. Now, I don't think her mom called her that. I think maybe that was the nickname later the Israelites gave to her. But how would you like to have a name like cow pile? You know, because where's her name? And she was the daughter of the king of Sidon. And if you look on your map, Sidon's outside of Israel. Not supposed to do that. She was a Canaanite. Not supposed to do that. And she was an avid and open worshiper of Baal, B-A-A-L. And he was the god of fertility, not just children, but also crops. He was the god of rain and the god of thunderstorms. And when he's depicted, he's shown riding on a chariot in the clouds, and often he has in his hand a lightning bolt. Okay, so he's in charge of the rain, he's in charge of the crops, and he's in charge of thunder, lightning, and fire from heaven. So he's going to come into the story pretty quick. So I want you to know who this guy was. That was a little detail that you don't notice because you just say Baal, but when you look into who he was, you go, oh, that adds a lot of color to the story. Okay? And Ahab in 1632 sets up an altar for this guy, Baal, because it's his wife's god, okay, who she worships, the Canaanites worship, in Samaria. And he doesn't just set up little shrines around the country, he now makes it the official religion of the country. Boy, had Israel fallen fast and hard. And this is only about 4 or 5 generations since Solomon. That chain really broke, didn't it? 1633, it says he did more to provoke the Lord to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. This is Ahab. What a nice guy. Never had a spiritual high point, and this is definitely the lowest point. And like I said, it's about 60 years or so past Solomon. Into this dire situation, is about as dark as you can possibly get, walks this guy named Elijah. And his name means, the Lord is my God. Probably not too many people that could say that. And talk about a tough audience. Okay, you've had 60 or 7 years of total disregard for the true God. Complete rejection of all of his laws, rampant idolatry, a totally pagan society. Every imaginable sin was considered normal. Remember what it says in Judges? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and now they're reaping what they wished for back then. And the result of those days, the broken chain we talked about some weeks back. And into that situation, God tells Elijah to go to King Ahab. Okay, this is the enemy. He's the most powerful guy in the northern kingdom. And I want you to tell him something. I want you to say, this is a short sermon, chapter 17, verse 1. He says, neither dew nor rain for the next few years, except at my command. Now imagine going to the most powerful person around, who's a total avid hater of God, and telling him, I'm going to stop the rain. Now, there's some significance to what he was saying, too. It's just a little short sermon, but the significance of a drought, God had told the Israelites in Leviticus, 3 times in Deuteronomy, if you forsake me, I will stop the rain and I will send drought. So this was a judgment on the people of Israel, the kingdom of Israel of the north. And now remember, who was this god Baal? He's the guy who's in charge of the rain. He's in charge of the clouds, in charge of the thunder, in charge of the lightning. But what does God say? I'm in charge of the rain. And I'm going to prove it to you by stopping it right now. And so the rain stops. And then God tells Elijah to do something. It seems kind of unusual. He tells him to go and hide in the Kerith ravine east of Jordan. Now, ravine is a fancy word for a deep ditch, by the way. Okay, so he goes and go hide in the ditch, and he says, don't worry, you're going to be drinking from a brook, okay, and ravens are going to bring you food. It's going to be interesting to watch, okay? What was God teaching Elijah right there? One, he's in charge of the rain, but also he's in the charge of providing you with food and water. That's who God is. Now, but think about it. Does that sound exciting? Maybe if you like to fish a lot, okay? So he's sitting watching a brook go by, and one minute he's confronting kings, controls the rain, pretty heady stuff, big cool stuff, and now he's hiding in a ditch and he's eating bird crumbs. Doesn't sound too exciting to me, kind of like you're on hold. Have you ever felt like you were on hold? You felt you were where God wanted you to be, but you weren't sure exactly what was God asking you to do, and you just felt like you were waiting. You had the phone to your ear, and you're listening to elevator music. And I can imagine that's how he felt, Elijah. We felt that way first few years in Romania. We knew, like I said, that's exactly where God wanted us to be. Just like Elijah, God told him specifically, this ditch, hang out, okay? But with no clear idea of what to do next. We had plans, big plans. We had trained for years, raised all this money, and arrived in Romania, and the rector dies, and that nice, big, wide door slams shut in our face. The specific program we had gone to launch wasn't happening. Now, it wouldn't have been so bad if there had been a brook, and I like to fish. I actually don't like to fish, okay? On top of everything else, the world began to fall apart for us. We were there just a few weeks, and our son, who was 18 months old, I had a pile of wood in the corner. I was going to build some bookcases, had a sharp corner on the wood. He stumbles, he falls, and he jams the corner of the wood smack into his temple. He still has a triangle-shaped dent in his head right today. Blood everywhere, that kind of stuff. Then he gets pneumonia. We're in another country. We don't know the language. We had heard the health care is not good. You really don't want to go to a doctor, but we had to do something. And then our first month there, we had bought a new car, and I totaled it. I'd never had an accident in my life, and here I'm totaling a car, okay? I tried to do a U-turn in the street. I couldn't get it into gear quick enough. Got T-boned by a taxi, totaled the car. Well, in this country, we've been totaled. In that country, they sort of straightened it out a little bit and bent it, and it kind of worked again crooked, okay? But I got a lot of mileage out of that accident, though, because the name of the taxi company that hit me was Bimbo. So our next prayer letter was clobbered by a bimbo. And a lot of people read that letter. They still talked about it for years later. But our program's dead, And we're wondering, why are we here? We know, God, you said, come here. This is not exactly what we're supposed to be doing. And I bet Elijah asked those same questions. Why do I have to wait? What's the point of this, God? I thought you had big plans for me. And the pinnacle of my life's ministry is a sermon that says it ain't going to rain. And here I am sitting next to a ditch all day long, watching the minnows swim by and waiting for the ravens to come and bring me some scraps. Wasn't I supposed to help send Israel back to serving you, to turn the people back to you? Look at 1 Kings 17, 5 and 6. So he did what the Lord told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of Jordan, and he stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Wow, exciting life. Okay, just sitting there next to the stupid book, watching the birds. No signal for his cell phone, no outlets to plug in his laptop. He didn't even have cable. Think about it. Nothing to do. And then again in chapter 17, verse 7 and 8, sometime later, doesn't say how long, the brook dried up. And he's probably going, I got to have water, don't I? But that door closed. And God made it very clear the door was closing. I don't want you to stay here anymore. Then the word of the Lord came to him, and he said, Go at once to Zaphareth, can't even say it, to the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Huh? What? He gets out his Rand McNally map out of his pocket. He looks at it. Where is Sidon? Hey, whoa, this isn't even in Israel. In fact, it's where Jezebel came from. What? You're sending me off to the pagan place? And a widow's supposed to take care of me? But he did. Verse 10, so he went. And in spite of all his doubts, which I'm sure he had, he walked by faith, and to his credit, he obeyed. Even when he didn't have the foggiest idea what God was up to, he listened, he obeyed, and he went. Verse 10, when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? Probably a perfectly normal thing to do. He's a foreigner traveling. So she's like, okay. And as she was going to get it, he calls out to her, and by the way, bring me a sandwich too. No, he asked for bread. Okay. And I can imagine her turning, one eyebrow up, and she says to him, as surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm now gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son so that we may eat it and die. Wow. Say what? And Elijah's thinking, I'm supposed to be like confronting kings and turning Israel back to you, and now I'm dependent upon this lonely widow who doesn't even have any food to provide for me. I was controlling the rain not long ago, and now nothing. And I don't even have bread or olive oil left. What am I supposed to eat? Elijah says to her in verse 13, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make me a small loaf of bread for me. Ooh, what? From what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself. And she just said, I only got enough for my son and me. How am I supposed to do that? I'm supposed to feed you first, and then... So she's like confused. And he says to her, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. Verse 15, she went away and did exactly as Elijah had told her. To her credit, she obeyed. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and for her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry. Sometime later, it doesn't say how long, The son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. And she says to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come here to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah says, "Give me your son." He took him up from her arms and carried him up in the upper room, laid him on a bed, lay down next to him 3 times, stretched himself over him, and he prays to the Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house, and he gave him back to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Wow, what a miracle. But was that public? Was that out for everyone to see? As far as we know, it only took place in her house. And he thought he was going to be confronting kings and prophets and all this stuff. Now, that was cool. I mean, it's not every day you get to raise somebody from the dead. But this really wasn't the public ministry I'm sure he was assuming he was going to have. Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Elijah impacted not a king, not a nation, but he did impact a lonely, poor widow that had completely run out of not just bread and oil, but of hope. Through Elijah, God brought her flour. Through Elijah, God brought her oil. God even brought back her son. First resurrection in the Bible. But most of all, Elijah brought back her hope and restored her faith. We may not change the world, but we can change the world for one person. And that's what Elijah was doing. Us, like Elijah, we had some of those same questions. What are we doing? Why are we waiting? God, I thought you had big plans for us. And God did have some big plans for us. Not fancy, not big fancy public ones, not raising the dead, not calling down fire from heaven. That would have been cool. But things just as rewarding. Setting up a library in Romania. Wow, doesn't that sound exciting? Classifying 50,000 books. Doesn't that sound exciting? And I carried every one of those books in boxes about 5 times over 20 years, by the way, just to let you know. But helping other missionaries adjust, get used to life in Romania, taking clothes and food to poor families, being Santa Claus out in villages. That was me. Kind of funny, because I'm pretty skinny. At least I was then. Taking a little girl home for Easter. The ministry we were involved in worked with families who had children who had HIV. And so a lot of our ministry was just bringing them flour and oil, a little encouraging word when they knew their child was going to die. Or one time I remember getting called in the middle of the night. A young boy was dying in the hospital, and the parents asked, is there any way he could come home and die at home? And the ambulance wouldn't take him. So they called and asked me if I would go and take a child home in the backseat of my car so he could die in the village. What did we do? Mostly just bringing flour and oil to those in need, not fancy stuff, not big fancy significant things, not showy things. Simply sharing faith and hope in Christ and sharing God's compassion to others, bringing flour and oil. Elijah listened to God. He went wherever God told him to. He didn't always understand what God had in mind for him, but when you think about it, nor do we. To be honest, we really don't usually know what God has in mind for us, do we? But the important thing is to be faithful, to listen, and if God says so, to wait. And when God does open a door, regardless of how ordinary or insignificant the door seems, we should step through it. Elijah probably didn't understand why he had to wait so long by a brook watching birds, or so long with this poor widow in a pagan country. But he did it. He obeyed. And God used him to touch people and to save a son and feed a widow and restore her hope. Elijah stepped through doors that God had opened, no matter how significant or how seemingly insignificant they were. And God used him. And in God's timing, God had great plans for him. Now let's turn to 1 Kings 18, okay? The story kind of shifts. Chapter 18, verse 1 mentions this is 3 years later. So between the ditch And with the widow, 3 years had passed in total obscurity for Elijah. But God was teaching him something. And God is now about to open some really big doors. Verses 16 through 19 of chapter 18, we read about 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah. They're not mentioned again. We're not sure if they didn't show up. And Elijah summons all of Israel, the northern kingdom, to come to Mount Carmel. And he's going to confront their God. Who's this God? Baal. Baal's in charge of the rain, the crops, fertility. He controls the clouds, the thunderstorm. He brings the lightning. And where did he ask them to meet him? Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is a mountain on the coast of Israel in the northern kingdom. It's about 1,800 feet high. There's a nice cool coastal breeze that comes off. Because of the elevation, it catches the clouds that goes by, and there's fairly common rain on the top of the mountain. So it makes the top of the mountain extremely green and luxurious and fertile. And it was the place where Baal was worshipped, where they believed was his home, because they saw this green fertility and the rain and the clouds. So what was Elijah and what was God doing? They were challenging Baal on his home turf. This is his place. Verse 20 to 24, there's an interesting play on words here. It says, "How long will you waver between two opinions?" This is Elijah talking to Israel. The word for waver is the same word for dance. Okay, so they're jiggling, okay, between two options. Verse 25 to 26, it talks about the prophets of Baal. From morning until noon, they danced around the altar. Same exact word. So what is he saying? Just as the Israelites were dancing between two opinions, following Baal or following God, the prophets of Baal were dancing around the altar. So you can see there's these interesting word plays that take place in Hebrew. Now look at chapter 18, verse 27. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. This is the prophets of Baal. They've been dancing all morning long. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's in deep thought, or busy, or traveling, or sleeping, and we just need to wake him up." So what did the prophets of Baal do? They shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice, all day long. And what was the result? Nothing. Not a drop. Not a lightning bolt. Not rain. No cloud. No nothing. And this is the God who's in charge of all that stuff. So paint that picture on top of this mountaintop. 450 prophets of Baal running around, slashing themselves, cutting themselves, bleeding, dancing, shouting out to their God. And Israel's gathered or watching, probably thousands of them, and Elijah is probably sitting on a rock in the shade, relaxing, and at noon he's getting kind of tired of this show, and he starts to taunt them. Now, you don't see this in your translation, but the word deep in thought or busy is actually a euphemism for going to the bathroom. So what does Elijah say? Oh, maybe he's on the toilet. You know, he's really, really mocking them. Talk about brave. There's 450 of them against one of him, but he knows God's on his side. When he's talking about maybe he's traveling, they believe that Baal accompanied the Phoenician sailors on their trips. So that was another jab at him. So instead they shout louder, they slash themselves. In contrast, the frantic spectacle of 450 priests of Baal going crazy, shouting, screaming, cutting themselves, and here's Elijah just waiting. He knows it's not going to work. Yawning, maybe now and then laughing, definitely taunting them. Midday comes, he gets out his bologna sandwich, he eats it, relaxes some more. They're exhausted. Sitting on a rock, he's having some shade. Man, there's no clouds, because we're going to find that out in a minute. But Elijah's very good at waiting, isn't he? He had just done that for 3 years. God had taught him how to wait in the ditch and with the widow, and in a dinky town in a poor widow's house. Verse 30, he rebuilds the altar that had been torn down. Not supposed to tear those down, but that's the state of the spirituality in the northern kingdom. He digs a trench around it. He arranges the wood, cuts and puts a bowl on the altar, pours three times. He pours 4 large jugs of water on it. Okay, he's going to make sure this is not flammable. Okay, even a ditch of water. But it's also very quiet work when you think about what the prophets of Baal had been doing. And I can imagine Elijah and maybe he had some helpers humming, whistling while they're working. And then he steps forward and he prays a very simple prayer, just 2 verses, verse 36 and 37. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, reminding them who they were, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, not Baal, and I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Verse 37, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Contrast that prayer, 2 sentences, with all day praying by the prophets of Baal. And then what happens? Verse 38, fire of the Lord, lightning, comes down. Fire from the sky comes down, burns up the sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the soil and the water. Contrast that with the prophets of Baal not getting a single drop out of their deal. And lightning. He's supposed to be in charge of that, but God sends the lightning instead. Then the people repent and they start to chant, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. What did Elijah's name mean? The Lord is my God. They were shouting something very similar to his very name. Talk about being on the mountaintop. And then Elijah says something odd to Ahab. Go eat and drink. The sound of a storm is coming. Who's supposed to be in charge of the thunderstorm? Baal? No, God is. Elijah sends his servant 7 times out to the edge of the mountain, looking over the Mediterranean Sea. And finally, on the 7th time, the servant says, I see a cloud as big as a man's fist off in the distance. What does Baal ride on? Chariots of clouds. Were the prophets ever able to bring him up? Nope. After 3 years of drought, the true God of storms, the true God of clouds, the true God of rain, the true God of lightning, the true God of creation, who sends the rain again, but only after the people repent. In the end, Elijah spoke to kings, to nations, and an entire nation repented and to return to him. Although when we read the story, it didn't last long, by the way. But it involved 3 years of waiting, 3 years in seeming obscurity in a ravine, by a brook, being fed by birds, being cared for by a poor widow. 3 years of just being faithful to God, stepping through open doors, no matter how small or how seemingly insignificant. We left in 1996 for Romania to do fancy stuff, to speak to kings and nations and start a department in a state university. But God had other plans for us, and that involved waiting by a brook, bringing flour and oil to the poor and hopeless. Didn't involve raising sons from the dead, that would have been cool, but it did involve being willing to drive them home to die. But in the end, God took us to the mountaintop and showed us his power. He sent the rain. He sent his showers of blessing. We didn't start a theology department in the State University, but we did help start a master's program in theology and social work. And when we were first offered to do that, we thought, that just sounds strange. But looking back on it, it was an amazing opportunity. Because it wasn't a denominational theology department, other people were willing to come. Because it wasn't just a Christian thing, it was also a social work department combined. Non-Christians even were taking classes. In fact, Orthodox priests and Catholic priests were taking the courses and, interestingly, sitting and listening to Baptist theology in a state university. Was God at work? Of course he was at work, doing amazing things. One of our colleagues was asked to be the head of the political science department at the university. Long story. Out of that, he became the consul general to South Africa, speaking to kings all the time, one of our colleagues. We taught in Bible schools. Pam taught New Testament Greek all around the country. We helped plant a church. I mentioned the library. So many, many things. Not all of them were big and fancy, but they were what God wanted us to do when he wanted us to do them. Because we were where God wanted us to be. even when it didn't seem like, in our mind, the best place to be. But it was the door that God had opened. Do you feel sometimes like you're just waiting? Maybe in a ravine or stuck in a ditch? You don't particularly feel out of God's will, but you feel like you're on hold. You just don't have a handle on exactly what His will is. And you don't understand the future. You don't understand what God's doing. One thing I can tell you, like He did for Elijah, God will provide for you. As long as He wants you there, the brook will keep flowing. As long as He wants you there, the birds will keep coming. As long as He wants you there, God will provide for you. And when it's His timing to move, He'll make it clear to you. He'll shut the door like He did for us in the department of the State University, or He may dry up the brook and tell you to move on. And when He does, He'll be with you there too. But while you're waiting, and maybe it's for health, for healing, maybe it's unresolved family issues, maybe it's conflicts, whatever it's going on in your life right now that you feel like, God, what is going on? I'm just on hold. Like Elijah, be faithful in the small things, those little acts of kindness. Maybe that's just a jar of oil or a sack of flour for someone in need, but those little things that demonstrate God's love. Focus on bringing hope to those around you, and you'll find hope yourself. Now, does God have a mountaintop experience like Mount Carmel for you? I don't know. Perhaps He does. Maybe it's not something as spectacular as He did for Elijah. But regardless of whether He does or He doesn't, you can count on Him to be there when you need Him. You can count on Him on the mountaintop. You can count on Him in the ravine. Because God is both on the mountaintop and in the ditch, He's there with you. And if you listen closely and look off in the distance, you may see the rain coming in a little cloud, because God is going to provide for you. He always has, He always will, because that's who God is. He loves us that much. And that was the rest of the story.